The train smelled of coal smoke and other people's lives. Margot Finley had learned, in 26 years of living close to strangers, that you could know a great deal about a person from what they left behind in a seat. The particular smell of cheap wool dried too close to a stove, a child's fingerprint pressed into the window grime, the ghost of a perfume too fine for the car it had been worn in. She had been sitting in the same hard bench seat since Columbus, and the woman who had occupied it before her had eaten an orange at some point and cried at some other point, and Margot thought that was probably most of what there was to know. She pressed her shoulder against the window and watched Ohio give itself up gradually, the way it always did. Not with any drama, not with cliffs or canyons or the sudden theater of geography she had heard the West possessed, but with a slow and weary relinquishment. Fields going gray with November, a farmhouse with one dark window, a stand of trees stripped to their architecture, every branch a question the sky declined to answer. She was not sorry to leave. That surprised her less than it might have surprised someone who had not spent the last 3 years breathing cotton dust in a building that had, in the end, decided to burn rather than continue. The letter was in her satchel. She did not need to take it out. She had read it enough times that the words had worn smooth in her memory, the way a river stone wears smooth, still present, still solid, but no longer capable of catching on anything. Margot, come west. I have land outside of Harlan Creek, 2 days east of the Colorado border. There is a house and room enough, and work if you want it. I am not asking for sentiment. I am asking because it makes practical sense. Buy a ticket to Caldwell Station, and someone will meet you. Thomas. Not asking for sentiment. That was Thomas exactly, or what Thomas had been when she last knew him. A man who communicated in the language of logistics, who expressed care through the arrangement of practical things. Their father had been the same way. It was perhaps the only inheritance the Finley family had managed to pass along intact. She had written back once, asking when. He had not replied. 3 weeks later, her foreman had handed her 2 weeks' severance in a brown envelope and told her the building had been condemned, and that was that. And she had stood on the street outside the mill in November air that tasted of ash and thought, well then. The arrangements had come through a man named Aldous Webb, who identified himself in a brief letter as a neighbor of her brother's, and a man of some standing in the county, which she took to mean he had money, or thought he did. He had enclosed the train ticket. He had written that someone would meet her at Caldwell Station, and that she should not worry about the particulars. She had not written back to thank him. She was not ungrateful, but she had learned that gratitude expressed too readily had a way of becoming currency that other people spent without asking. The train arrived at Caldwell Station 40 minutes past the hour it was supposed to, which was, the conductor informed the car with the weary authority of a man who had made this announcement many times, entirely normal for this stretch of line in November. Margot was the only person who stepped off. She stood on the platform with her leather satchel in one hand and the brown paper parcel under her arm, and looked at what there was to look at. The station itself was a modest wooden building, painted a red that had faded to the color of dried blood. Beyond it, a main street of perhaps 4 blocks, a water tower, and then the land, enormous and flat and pale under a sky that had been thinking about snow all day, without committing to it. The wind had an opinion about everything. There was a man standing at the far end of the platform. He was perhaps 40, or perhaps the kind of 35 that certain kinds of hard living produces. She could not immediately tell. He was tall in the way that seemed less a physical fact than a habit, as though he had spent a long time needing to see over things. He wore a dark coat that had been good once, and a hat that had never been particularly good, and he was holding it in his hands rather than wearing it, which she thought was strange given the cold, until she understood that he had taken it off as she stepped down from the train and had not put it back on, and that this was a gesture of some kind, though she could not yet determine what kind. He had brown hair going gray at the temples. He had the face of a man who was in the middle of deciding something. She walked toward him because there was no one else on the platform, and because she had not come this far to stand still. "Miss Finley," he said, not a question. "Yes?" "I'm Cale Sutton." He extended his hand and she shook it. His grip was brief and honest. "I'm a neighbor of... I was acquainted with your brother. I have a wagon out front. It's about 2 hours to the property." She noticed the correction. Was acquainted, but she found it alongside several other small observations she had already made. The way he had not quite met her eyes when he said Thomas's name, the hat still turning in his hands, the slight forward lean of a man who is preparing to say something and keeps deciding against it. And she said only, "All right." "Can I take your bag?" "I have it." He nodded as though this was the answer he had expected and turned, and she followed him around the side of the building to where a bay horse stood hitched to a flatbed wagon with 2 wooden seats up front and a bed that smelled of hay and something medicinal she couldn't place. He climbed up to the seat, and she climbed up beside him without assistance, which she could see he had been about to offer and then thought better of. They pulled out onto the main street. A woman on the boardwalk outside a dry goods store looked at the wagon and then looked away. A dog sleeping in the road moved aside with the dignity of an animal that was moving of its own volition, and not because of anything as undignified as necessity. "Long trip?" Sutton asked. "Long enough." "You came from Ohio?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The wagon wheels found a rut and recovered from it. "You worked in a mill." "I did." Aldous Webb mentioned it in his letter. He mentioned you'd had some difficulty with the fire. She looked at him. "I wasn't in the fire. I was out of work because of it. That's a different kind of difficulty." "Yes," he said. "I expect it is." She turned back to the road ahead of them, which was straight and gray, and went on until it met the sky. "Is it far, Thomas's land?" The letter said 2 hours. Something passed across his face. It was quick, and she almost missed it. Not quite pain, not quite guilt, but something that lived in the same neighborhood as both. 2 hours, he confirmed, give or take. She had the sense, sharp and specific as the smell of something burning, that there was a conversation he was trying to find his way into and couldn't. She had met people like this before, people who carried news they didn't know how to put down. Her mother had been like this at the end, when the doctor had told her first and she'd had to come home and tell the family. That particular quality of silence. The way a person breathed differently when they were holding something in. She could have asked him directly. She considered it. But she was tired from the train and the cold and the long, flat fact of November, and whatever it was could wait 2 hours, and she thought perhaps he needed those 2 hours as much as she did. The land was extraordinary. She had not expected that. She had expected useful land, practical land, the kind of land that fed people and asked a great deal in return. She had not expected beauty, or what she recognized as beauty, even though she was not a woman who used the word often, having been raised in a tradition that regarded prettiness as beside the point, and sentiment as a luxury for people with more time than sense. But the land here was something else. It went on in every direction with a kind of absolute conviction, and the sky above it was the largest sky she had ever been under, and the light in the late afternoon was coming in low and golden from the west, and laying itself across the grass in long strips, and she understood for the first time why people came here. Not for the practicality of it, though there was that too, but for the feeling of being small in a way that was, for once, not diminishing. She said nothing about this. Sutton drove in silence for most of the journey. He pointed out landmarks when they appeared, a creek that ran behind the Aldous Webb property, a ridge to the north that was good for nothing but looking at, a particular stand of cottonwoods that marked the boundary between 2 claims. He spoke about these things with the ease of a man who had lived here long enough for the land to be ordinary to him, which she thought was something you probably didn't notice happening until it already had. She asked him once about Aldous Webb, whether he was a reasonable man, whether he had been a good neighbor to Thomas. Sutton said, "He's a man who knows what he wants and generally finds a way to get it. That can look like a lot of different things depending on what he wants at any given time." She looked at him. "That's not exactly an answer." "No," he agreed, "it's not." The sun was nearly gone when they turned off the main track onto a narrower one, and she saw the house at the end of it, a low wooden structure, well built if plain, with a porch running along the front and a barn set back to the left and a kitchen garden gone to frost along the south side. There was smoke coming from the chimney. She said, "Someone's been keeping it." "I have," Sutton said, "on and off, since—" He stopped. "Since." She turned to look at him fully then, because the word had arrived without anything after it, and she was a practical woman who did not waste time waiting for things to resolve themselves when she could simply ask. "Mr. Sutton," she said, "how long have you been trying to tell me something?" He had stopped the wagon in front of the porch. He was looking at the house. The hat was in his hands again. "Since the station," he said quietly. The smoke rose straight up from the chimney in the still cold air. The horse shifted its weight. Somewhere out in the gray distance, something, a bird maybe, or the wind finding a loose board, made a sound that might have been anything. "Tell me," she said. He turned to look at her then, and she saw it clearly for the first time. Not guilt, not quite, but the face of a man who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that he'd stopped noticing the weight until someone asked him to put it down. "I brought you here first," he said, "because I thought you should see it because I didn't know how to." He stopped again, looked at the house, looked at her. "Miss Finley, your brother Thomas has been dead for 2 years." The words arrived in the cold air and stayed there. She sat with them for a moment that was longer than a moment. The light was almost gone now. The smoke from the chimney went up and disappeared into a sky that had finally, quietly, begun to snow. "Then whose house is this?" she asked. And the way he looked at her when she asked it, careful and complicated and carrying something she couldn't yet name, told her that the answer to that question was not going to be simple, and that the 2 hours he had taken to bring her here had not been enough time for either of them to prepare for what came next. The fire had been laid before she arrived. Margot noticed that first, the way a person notices the small, deliberate things when the large ones are too much to hold. Someone had stacked the wood in the hearth with care, with intention, and the kindling had caught and the logs had settled into a slow, even burn that suggested hours of attention rather than minutes. The house was warm. It had been made warm on purpose for her by someone who had known she was coming. She stood in the center of the front room with her coat still buttoned and her bag still in her hand, and looked at the fire for a long moment before she looked at anything else. The room was spare, but not empty. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a shelf along the east wall holding a coffee tin, a chipped ceramic mug, and 3 books whose spines she couldn't read from where she stood. A window that faced west and let in the last of the gray afternoon light. And on the wall above the shelf, a photograph in a plain wooden frame. A young man standing in a field, squinting into the sun, one hand raised to shade his eyes, as though he'd been caught mid-gesture, not yet ready for the picture to be taken. She recognized the gesture before she recognized the face. Thomas. She set her bag down on the floor very carefully, as though setting it down too hard might break something she hadn't identified yet. The man, Cale, he'd said his name was, Cale Sutton, had come in behind her and stopped just inside the door. He hadn't spoken since the platform. Not during the drive out in the truck, not when they'd turned off the main road onto the dirt track that wound through the flat, snow-dusted fields, not when he'd cut the engine and sat for a moment with both hands still on the wheel before getting out. He'd carried her bag from the truck to the door without being asked. He'd opened the door with a key he'd produced from his coat pocket. He'd stood aside to let her in first. And then he'd said, "It's yours. And Thomas left it to you, and he just didn't tell you why." And those 3 sentences had rearranged something in her chest that she was still in the process of rearranging back. "Sit down," she said. It wasn't a request. He sat. He took the chair nearest the door, which she thought was either instinct or conscience, a man leaving himself an exit. She took the other chair and turned it so that it faced him rather than the table, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at him the way she'd learned to look at foremen and landlords and anyone else who held information she needed and was disinclined to give it freely. Cale Sutton was not a large man, but he was a solid one. 30 or so, she guessed, maybe a few years beyond. His face was weathered in the particular way of men who spent their days outdoors in dry country, the skin drawn tight across the cheekbones, the lines at the corners of his eyes deep and permanent, the kind of tan that didn't fade in winter. His hands, resting on his knees, were the hands of someone who worked with them constantly. He had taken off his hat when he came inside, and his hair was dark and needed cutting, and he was looking at the floor between them with an expression she was beginning to understand was not evasiveness, but something closer to grief. "How long?" she said. He looked up. "How long has he been dead?" A breath went out of him, slow, deliberate, the breath of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has finally been given permission to put it down. 2 years, he said. March will be 2 years. She absorbed this. Outside, the snow was falling in earnest now, and the sound of it was no sound at all, just a deepening of the quiet that already lay over everything out here, the particular silence of flat land under an open sky. "And the letter," she said. He wrote it before. Cale's voice was even, but it cost him something to keep it that way. He was sick for a while before the end. He wrote a handful of letters, gave them to Aldous Webb. You know the name from the arrangements, yes. He gave them to Aldous and said to send them when the time came, when things were settled. He paused. It took a while for things to get settled. The land, the deed. Thomas didn't have a will written proper, and there were some complications with the county. Aldous did what he could, but it took time. 2 years, she said. Yes. He's been dead 2 years, and I've been in Ohio for 2 years thinking he was alive, and that there was somewhere I could go if things got bad enough. She said it without heat, which was more frightening than if she'd said it with anger. I wrote him letters. Cale was quiet for a moment. Aldous kept them. He didn't know what else to do with them. I want them back. Yes, he said immediately. Of course. She stood up and walked to the shelf and looked at the photograph again. Thomas at, what, 25? 26? The squint that she'd always teased him about, the one their mother had called his suspicious look because he aimed it at everything equally, sunshine and strangers and plates of food he hadn't cooked himself. He'd been 23 when he came west. She'd been 19 and had thought he was the bravest person she'd ever known, and also possibly the most foolish, and she had told him both things at the train station when he left. Write me, she'd said. Every week, he'd promised. He had, for about 3 years. Then the letters had thinned, then they'd come in clusters, 3 at once after a 2-month silence, then nothing for a month. Then one very short one that said only that he was well and the wheat was coming in and that he'd been thinking about their mother's kitchen, the smell of it in the mornings. She'd written back, asking if he was all right. The next letter, the one inviting her west, had come 4 months later. She'd thought the delay was distance. She'd thought the brevity was Thomas being Thomas. She turned back to Cale. Why did he leave it to me? You were his sister. He had friends here, neighbors. You and this Aldous Webb and whoever else. She gestured at the room, at the fire, at the evidence of people who had cared for this place in Thomas's absence. He'd been here 10 years. I'd been here 10 minutes. Why leave it to me and not to someone who knew what to do with it? Cale looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him deciding something, weighing it, turning it over. Because he wanted you to have a reason to stay, he said finally. She waited. He worried about you. He talked about you, not constantly, but when things came up. When the mill in Alderton closed, he heard about it somehow. I don't know how news travels the way it does, but he heard, and he was worried. He said you'd stay there even if it was falling down around you, because that's what you did. You stayed. A faint, complicated expression crossed his face, not quite a smile. He said it like it was both the best and the worst thing about you. Margot said nothing. She was thinking about the condemned mill, about the foreman who'd told her they were closing in 2 weeks, and the 2 weeks that had stretched to 6, while she'd kept showing up every morning because she had not known what else to do. Thomas had known her well. "The land is good," Cale continued. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, and something shifted in his manner. Less apology, more practicality, and she suspected this was closer to his natural register. 40 acres. The south field's been fallow 2 seasons, but that's not damage. That's just rest. The house needs some work. The roof on the back section is soft, and it'll want attention before proper spring. And the well pump sticks in the cold, but it runs. Thomas's tools are in the barn. His seed stock is in the barn too, what's left of it. Aldous and I have been keeping an eye on things. You've been maintaining this property for 2 years. Seemed like the right thing. For a dead man's land. For whoever was going to come. He met her eyes. He told us you'd come eventually. He was certain of it. She looked at him. At this man who had driven an hour to a train station to collect a woman he'd never met, who had carried her bag and built her fire and sat in her dead brother's chair with his hat in his hands, and told her the truth as carefully as he could manage. And she felt the particular loneliness of being accurately known by someone who was no longer alive to know you. "You should have told me at the station," she said. "I know." "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the snow tapped lightly at the window glass like something asking to be let in. "Because you'd just stepped off a train," he said. "Because you had that letter in your pocket, and you'd been holding on to it for however many miles it took to get here. Because—" He stopped, started again. "Because I've had to tell people things they didn't want to hear before, and I've learned there's no good place for it, but there are worse places than others. A train platform in the snow is a worse place." She considered this. It was not, she decided, a cowardly reason. It was, in its way, a kind one, though kindness that delayed pain was its own complicated thing. "Aldous Webb," she said. "I'd like to meet him." "Tomorrow. I'll take you." "And I'll need to see the deed, and whatever documents there are from the county." "Aldous has all of that." "Good." She looked around the room again. The fire, the shelf, the photograph, the 2 chairs where 2 people who had not known each other this morning were now sitting in the early dark of a winter evening. "Is there food?" Something loosened slightly in his expression. "There's food. Mrs. Aldous sent a pot of something. It's on the stove." "Then you should stay and eat," she said, "before you drive back in the snow." It was not a warm invitation, but it was a genuine one, and he seemed to understand the difference. "All right," he said. She went to the stove, and he stayed where he was, and the fire settled in the hearth, and neither of them spoke for a little while. The snow outside was serious now, the kind that accumulated, the kind that changed the shape of things by morning. It was only when she lifted the lid from the pot and the smell of it, onion and broth and something herbed, something her mother had made, rose up and hit her in the throat like a fist, that she understood she was going to cry. And she stood very still with the lid in her hand and breathed through it until she didn't. Then she got 2 bowls from the shelf and set them on the table and called him over. They ate in the house that had been her brother's and was now hers, and Cale Sutton told her about the land, the soil composition, the drainage patterns, the particular stubbornness of the South Field. And she listened and asked precise, practical questions, and neither of them mentioned Thomas again that evening. But later, when Cale had gone and the fire had burned low, she took the photograph down from the wall and sat with it in her lap. And she thought about the letter in her coat pocket. The letter Thomas had written knowing he was dying, knowing she didn't know, choosing his words for a woman who would read them too late. And she thought, I haven't read it yet. She had carried it for 3 days on the train. She had held it in her hands on the platform. She had kept it in her pocket through the drive and the fire and the supper and the explanation of her dead brother's land. She had not opened it. She was not sure, she realized, if she was saving it or avoiding it. She was not sure there was a difference. She set the photograph face down on the table, and she went to the window, and she looked out at the snow that had covered the fields and the road and the tracks of Cale Sutton's truck. And she thought about what he'd said. Thomas left it to you because he wanted you to have a reason to stay. And she thought about the 40 acres under the snow, the fallow south field, the roof that needed mending, the pump that stuck in cold weather. She thought about Thomas writing that letter while he was dying, choosing every word for her. She reached into her pocket and felt, beneath the letter she already knew about, the edge of a second envelope she had never noticed before, smaller, stiffer, tucked underneath, with her name on it in handwriting that was not her brother's. The envelope sat on the table between them like a third party to the conversation. Margot had not opened it. She had placed it down with the same deliberate care she gave to fragile things, a cracked cup, a last match, and stepped back from it. Cale Sutton stood near the door with his hat in his hands, watching her with the expression of a man who had already delivered one impossible piece of news tonight and had not yet recovered from the effort. "Did you know about this?" she asked. "No." The word came without hesitation, and she believed him. His eyes were on the envelope with something that looked like genuine unease. Aldous Webb. Could be. He handled the correspondence. "My mother has been dead for 11 years, Margot said. Cale said nothing to that. There was nothing useful to say, and he seemed to understand it. She appreciated him for it more than she could have explained. She did not open the letter, not yet. She put it back in her pocket beside Thomas's, and the weight of both of them settled against her hip like something physical. She would need to be alone to read it. She would need to be in a state of mind she was not currently in. "It's late," she said. Cale put his hat on. "I'll come back in the morning." "Webb will have your other letters. I'll have them to you by midday." "Thank you." He paused at the door, and she thought he was going to say something else, something sympathetic or explanatory, or worse, apologetic. Instead, he only nodded once, the way people nod when words have reached the end of their usefulness, and he went out into the dark. She stood in the quiet of Thomas's house, her house, apparently, though she could not yet make that word fit, and listened to the sound of his wagon pulling away down the frozen road. Then she sat down at the table, folded her hands on top of it, and allowed herself 2 full minutes of not thinking anything at all. She was still at the table when the boy appeared. She had not heard him come down the stairs. One moment the room was empty, and the next there was a child standing in the doorway to the hall, a boy of perhaps 9, wearing a coat over his nightshirt, his feet in unlaced boots, holding a lamp with the particular careful steadiness of someone who had been told many times not to spill the oil. He regarded her without surprise, which told her he had likely been awake and listening for some time. He had his father's eyes. She knew that immediately, though she had only known his father for 2 hours. Dark, watchful eyes that took things in and gave nothing back. "You're the woman from Ohio," he said. "I am." She did not adjust her voice for him the way some adults did with children, higher, softer, simplified. He didn't look like a child who would appreciate it. "You're Cale Sutton's boy." "Seb." He came the rest of the way into the room and set the lamp on the counter with the same careful deliberateness as before. Then he turned and looked at her directly, with an assessment so frank and unguarded that it was almost more unsettling than an adult's scrutiny. He was cataloging her. She let him. "Are you going to stay?" he asked. "I don't know yet." He considered this. "Most people who don't know yet don't stay." "I've heard that's true." "Mr. Thomas stayed," Seb said. "He didn't know at first either." She was quiet for a moment. "Did you know him well, Thomas?" "He let me sit with him when he was sick." The boy said it plainly, without sentiment, but there was something in the plainness itself that told her how much the sitting had meant. "He talked a lot at the end. About Ohio, mostly." About a sister. Margot looked at the boy's face and found she had to look away again. She looked at the lamp instead. "He talked about you," Seb said, in case she had missed it. "I understood that. He said you were stubborn." "He wasn't wrong." Seb moved to the chair across from her and sat down in it, not with permission, but not defiantly either, simply with the efficiency of someone who had decided the chair was where he needed to be. He folded his hands on the table in a posture that was, she realized, almost exactly a mirror of hers. She wondered if he knew he was doing it. "There's eggs in the morning," he said. "I collect them. I'll show you where the hens are if you want." "All right." "The pump sticks. You have to hold the handle down first before you pull up." "Your father mentioned that." "He forgets to say the second part," Seb said, with the mild gravity of someone noting a long-standing administrative failure. "You have to hold it down first. Most people just pull up and then they're confused." "I'll remember." He looked at her hands on the table, then at her face. Then he appeared to make a decision. Not the large decision she sensed, but a smaller preliminary one, a kind of provisional ruling. "The south room has a better mattress," he said. "Da put you in the north room because it was closest to the stove, but the south room has the better mattress. I can move the stovepipe bracket if you want to switch." "I appreciate that," she said. "I'll see how the north room suits me first." He nodded, as if this were a reasonable position. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving around the corners of the house with a low, persistent sound, the kind of sound that made you aware of walls and what they kept out. The lamp between them put out a small yellow circle of warmth. "Your father didn't want to bring me here tonight," Margot said. "He wanted to tell me at the station." Seb was quiet. "But he brought me here instead. Was that his idea or yours?" The boy looked at the lamp for a long moment. "Mine," he said, with the slight reluctance of someone admitting to a decision they still believe was correct. "He didn't know what to do. He was going to tell you on the platform, and then he was going to leave you there. And you thought that was a poor plan. You'd come a long way," Seb said, "and it was cold." She studied him, the serious face, the careful hands, the coat pulled over the nightshirt as though he had dressed himself for a formal occasion. 9 years old, and he had overruled his father's instinct in order to bring a stranger in from the cold. She thought about what kind of child did that, and what kind of life shaped that kind of child. "Where's your mother?" she asked gently. The boy's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. "She left," he said. 3 years ago. I'm sorry. Da doesn't talk about it." He said this without accusation, as simple statement of household policy. "Millie doesn't remember her much." "Millie is your sister?" "She's 4. She'll want to follow you around." He paused. "She follows everyone around. You can tell her to stop and she will for a while, but then she forgets." "I don't mind being followed," Margot said. Something in Seb's face shifted again, a fractional change, barely visible, the way ice shifts before it cracks. Not warmth, exactly. Something more guarded than warmth, but movement in that direction. "You should sleep," he said, standing up. He picked up the lamp and held it out to her. "I know where everything is in the dark." She took the lamp from him. "Thank you, Seb." He was already halfway to the hallway. He stopped without turning around. "He feels bad," he said, meaning his father. "He's been feeling bad about it for 2 months. Since he knew you were coming and the letters still weren't sorted." A pause. "He's not good at saying things like that." "I know," she said. "I could tell." Seb went upstairs. She listened to the careful footsteps crossing the floor above her, the soft closing of a door. She sat alone with the lamp and thought about a 9-year-old boy who ran a household, who overruled his father's worst instincts, who had sat with her dying brother and listened to him talk about Ohio, who had just, in his spare and meticulous way, defended his father to a stranger without being asked. She reached into her pocket. She took out both envelopes and laid them on the table. Thomas's letter she already knew. She had read it twice on the train before she'd even known it was a farewell, and now she understood every careful word of it differently. "I want you to have a reason to stay." She picked up the second envelope. The handwriting was her mother's, unmistakably, achingly her mother's, with the particular looping M and the way the F in Finley curled back on itself. A habit her mother had developed in girlhood and never lost. 11 years dead. Margot had stood at the grave. She had helped carry the box. She turned the envelope over. The seal was intact. No one had opened it. She slid her finger under the flap. The letter inside was short, 1 page,
written on paper so thin she could see the shadow of the lamp through it. She read it once, quickly, the way you read things you're afraid of. Then she read it again, slowly, the way you read things that have changed the shape of everything. Her hands were very still. She looked up at Thomas's photograph on the wall. Thomas at 20, before the West, before the illness, before all of it. Thomas, with that particular expression he'd had, half serious and half laughing, as though the world were a joke he was generous enough to share.
You knew, she thought. You knew, and you sent this with me. She folded the letter carefully, put it back in its envelope, and sat for a long time in the lamplight while the wind moved around the house. In the morning, she would have to decide whether to tell Cale Sutton what she had found. In the morning, she would have to decide about the land, the house, the south field, the pump that stuck in cold weather. But first, she would have to reckon with the fact that her mother, dead 11 years, appeared in the letter to have known something about Thomas's land, about this land, that suggested the invitation west had not been Thomas's idea alone, and that the name written in the final line of the letter, the name her mother had underlined twice with a hand that must have been unsteady, was a name Margot did not recognize. Not Thomas, not Aldous Webb, not Cale Sutton. Someone else entirely. The name was Evander Finley. Margot sat with the envelope in her lap for a long time after reading it, long enough for the fire in the small iron stove to settle from a bright, crackling thing into a steady, purposeful burn. She had read her mother's letter 3 times by then, 4 if she counted the first reading, which had been less a reading than a collision. Her eyes had moved over the words without fully receiving them, the way the body sometimes refuses what the mind already suspects. Evander Finley, her father's brother, a man she had never met, a man her father had not spoken of in the 31 years of Margot's life, not once, not in passing, not even in the way people sometimes speak of the dead, briefly, carefully, as if testing the temperature of old grief. Her mother had mentioned him twice, and both times in the context of before, which was what her mother called everything that had happened prior to Margot's birth, as though Margot's arrival had constituted some definitive ending to a previous era. Before was where her parents had been young and uncertain and prone to errors. Before was a country Margot had never been permitted to visit. And yet here was before, written in her mother's unsteady hand, folded inside a letter from a dead woman to her dead son, found in a house that had apparently been waiting for Margot, whether she knew it or not. She put the letter back into the envelope with great care, as though it were something that could be damaged further. She set it on the table beside Thomas's letter, and the two of them sat there together, side by side, and she looked at them for a moment before she turned her face away. She was still sitting at the table when the door opened. Not a knock, not a hesitation. The door simply opened, as doors open when the person on the other side has not yet learned that they are supposed to knock. And Lily Aldridge walked in with the absolute confidence of a child who has decided that a place is hers to enter. She was small for 6, Margot thought, or perhaps not small, perhaps simply concentrated, the way some people are, as though they contain more than their size suggests. She had Cale's dark eyes and a quantity of brown hair that had been braided at some point in the recent past and had since conducted a successful rebellion against the arrangement. She was wearing one boot and carrying the other. She looked at Margot with frank, uncomplicated appraisal. "Seb said you were pretty," she announced. "He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like it was a problem." Margot looked at the child for a moment. "And what do you think?" Lily considered this with visible seriousness. "I think your eyes are too far apart," she said, "but in a way that works out." "Thank you," Margot said. Lily dropped the boot on the floor and climbed into the chair across the table. Thomas's chair, Margot noted, the one with the worn armrests, and folded her arms on the surface with the ease of someone settling in for an extended stay. She looked at the two envelopes. "Those are letters," she said. "They are. Are they bad letters or good letters?" Margot considered the question honestly. "I'm not certain yet." Lily nodded as though this were a satisfactory answer. She studied the envelopes for another moment, then looked up at Margot with the expression of someone who has been waiting patiently to address the real matter. "Did you know Thomas was dead when you came?" The directness of it landed somewhere between a slap and a relief. Margot found she preferred it, actually, to the careful circumvention everyone else had been practicing. "No," she said. "I didn't know." "That's what I thought," Lily said. "Because when Papa came home from the station, he looked the way he looks when he's done something wrong. Except he hadn't done anything wrong. So I knew something else must have happened." She paused. "He looked like that when he forgot to tell Seb about the school program. Seb had a part. He said 3 lines, and then he forgot the 4th one and cried in front of everyone." "That sounds difficult." "It was worse for Papa than for Seb," Lily said, with a certainty that suggested she had given this considerable thought. "Seb stopped being upset by the next morning. Papa felt bad for a week." She looked at Margot. "Did my Papa feel bad about Thomas?" "I think he did," Margot said. "He still does," Lily said simply. "He goes to the grave sometimes. Not as much as before, but sometimes. He thinks we don't know, but Seb followed him once." She picked up the corner of the nearest envelope and set it down again, a small, restless motion. "Thomas used to let me sit in this chair." "I know," Margot said. "Seb told me." "Seb told you the useful things," Lily said, with a trace of something that might have been professional criticism. "He told you about the hens and the pump." "He always tells the useful things." She looked at Margot steadily. "I'm going to tell you the other things." Margot set her hands flat on the table. "All right," she said. What Lily told her over the next 20 minutes arrived in the nonlinear, associative manner of a child's recounting, which was to say, it arrived in the order of emotional significance rather than chronology, and required some assembly. Thomas had taught Lily to count to 100 by counting fence posts on the eastern boundary of the property. He had given her a jar of honey once and told her it was magic honey, which she had believed for approximately 2 weeks before Seb had explained the bees, and she was still somewhat annoyed about the disenchantment. He had a cough that had started small and then hadn't. He had kept a photograph of a woman on the windowsill in his bedroom, which Margot had not yet seen. And when Lily asked him who it was, he had said, "Someone I should have written to sooner." And Lily had asked if he was going to write to her, and he had said, "I already did, but I waited too long and now it might not matter." And Lily had found this very sad without fully understanding why.
"Was the woman in the photograph you?" Lily asked. Margot felt the question settle in her chest like a stone in still water. "I don't know," she said. "I haven't seen the photograph." "I could show you." "Not yet," Margot said. "Not today." Lily accepted this with the equanimity of a child who has learned that adults sometimes need time to approach things. She swung her feet against the chair legs in a slow, rhythmic way. "He talked about you," she said. "He said you were the stubborn one." "Seb told me that too." "Did Seb tell you what Thomas said after that?" Margot looked at her. "No." Lily's feet stopped swinging. She looked at the table surface, then back up at Margot with an expression that was, for the first time, something other than direct. Something that was trying to decide whether directness was appropriate here, or whether this was one of the cases that called for the caution she had not yet fully learned, and was not certain she wanted to. She decided, apparently, in favor of the truth. "He said stubborn is how you survive when no one's coming to help you." She said it carefully, as though she had memorized it. "He said it like it was the best thing a person could be." The silence after that lasted long enough for the fire to shift again, and for Margot to realize, with some distant surprise, that her eyes were wet. She did not cry. She had not cried since the train station in Ohio, when she had stood on the platform and told herself she was going somewhere better, and the saying of it had required all the moisture her grief had available. But her eyes were wet, and she was aware of Lily watching her with the careful attention of a child who is deciding whether to acknowledge what she sees. Lily, to her credit, did not acknowledge it. Instead, she said, "Are you going to stay?" "I don't know yet," Margot said. "The house needs someone," Lily said. "The hens need someone. The pump." "The pump is temperamental," Margot said. "Your brother told me." "The pump is mean," Lily corrected, with feeling. "Seb says temperamental because he's trying to be fair to the pump." "But it's just mean." Despite everything, despite the letters on the table and the name she didn't recognize and the photograph she hadn't yet looked at, Margot felt something shift very slightly in her chest, like a door not opening but becoming, perhaps, less firmly closed. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. Lily nodded. She slid off the chair with the boneless ease of a small child and retrieved her single boot from the floor. She put it on without sitting down, one hand braced on the table edge, with the total unself-consciousness of someone who has never considered that this might look precarious. She straightened up. She looked at Margot one final time with those direct, uncomplicated eyes. "Thomas said you'd come," she said. "He said it before he got really sick. He said—" She stopped, and for a moment she was just a 6-year-old girl who missed someone, and the years she didn't have yet were visible in her face as an absence. "He said she'll come when she's ready, and when she gets here, make sure she knows she's supposed to be here." She moved toward the door. Margot watched her. "Lily," she said. The girl turned.
"The name on that envelope," Margot said, and she touched the corner of her mother's letter without picking it up. "Evander Finley. Have you ever heard that name? Has your father ever said it?" Lily's expression shifted. It was not the blankness of ignorance. It was something else. The slight, involuntary stilling of a child who has heard a word that belongs to the adult world. The world of closed doors and lowered voices, and who has filed it away in the careful way children file things they know they are not supposed to have heard. "Lily," Margot said quietly. "Papa said that name," Lily said, "once, to Aldous Webb. They were talking on the porch, and they didn't know I was behind the water barrel." She looked at Margot, and for the first time there was something in her face that resembled the caution she had not yet learned. "Papa said, he said, if Evander Finley shows up here before she's settled, I need to know about it." The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like something breathing. "And has he," Margot said, "shown up?" Lily's hand was on the doorframe. "Not yet," she said. She went out into the afternoon, one boot heavier than the other, and left Margot alone in Thomas's house, with 2 letters, a name she didn't recognize, and the sudden, absolute certainty that the westbound train had not brought her somewhere she was going. It had brought her somewhere she had always, without knowing it, been heading. The letter with the broken seal was from Aldous Webb. Margot read it standing up, which she would later think was the right instinct. Some things ought to be received on your feet. It was written in the cramped, slanting hand of a man who had learned to write late and never fully trusted the practice. Each word pressed hard into the paper, as though he expected it to try to escape. "Miss Finley, your brother asked me to hold certain items until such time as they could be properly delivered. I have done this to the best of my ability. There are 3 letters in your brother's hand, 1 ledger, and a tin box whose contents I have not examined. I want you to know I have not examined them. I am not a man who reads what isn't his. I am also not a man who comes to town easily. My wife is unwell, and has been for some time. Cale Sutton has offered to collect these items on your behalf, and I have agreed to this arrangement, though I want it on record, and I am writing this so that it is on record, that I fulfilled my obligation to Thomas Finley faithfully and to the letter. I am sorry for your loss. He was a good man, and he spoke of you often. Yours, A. Webb. Below the signature, in a different ink and a shakier hand, as though added later and in some haste. There is one more thing. I do not know how to say it except to say it plainly. Thomas had a visitor, approximately 6 weeks before he died. He did not introduce this man to me or to anyone else I know of. I saw them from a distance, standing near the east fence line. They spoke for perhaps 20 minutes. When I asked Thomas afterward who the man was, he said only that it was old business and that it was settled. I believed him because I wanted to. I am not sure now that I should have. Margot read this postscript twice. Then she folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it with the others. She stood at the table for a long moment with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the window, where the afternoon light had shifted from gold to something thinner and more cautious. The grass beyond the glass
moved in a low wind. The hens had gone quiet. Old business, she thought, and it was settled. She had known men who used that phrase. They used it when a thing was not settled at all, but when they had decided, for reasons of pride or fear or exhaustion, to stop fighting it. She had known her brother well enough to know he was that kind of man. Cheerful in a way that required effort, generous with the effort so that no one would notice how much it cost him. She pulled out the chair and sat down. Cale came back at 2:30 with a flour sack folded over one arm and a look on his face that told her the trip to Webb's had not been uncomplicated. He set the sack on the table without ceremony. 3 letters, a ledger, and a tin box. Webb sends his regards. "I know," Margot said. "He wrote." Cale looked at the letter on the table. Something moved briefly in his expression. Not quite relief, not quite the opposite of it. "He's a careful man." "He mentioned a visitor," Margot said. "Someone Thomas met with near the east fence line, about 6 weeks before he died. He said it was old business." Cale was quiet. "Did you know about this?" she asked. He pulled out the other chair and sat down without being invited. Margot noted this. It was the first time he had done so, and she took it as a sign that something had shifted, that he had decided, somewhere between Webb's farm and her door, to stop managing her. "I knew Thomas had a conversation with someone," he said. "I didn't know who. He didn't tell me, and I didn't push. That was probably a mistake." "Probably," Margot agreed. "What I know is that in the last month of his life, he was different." Cale turned his hat in his hands, a slow rotation that she was beginning to recognize as his thinking gesture. He'd been sick for a while, and he'd made a kind of peace with it. You could say he was even-tempered, ready. And then something changed. He wasn't frightened exactly, but he was watchful. He started asking me questions about the county clerk's office, what records they kept, whether a letter filed there would be legally binding. Margot's hands stilled. "He filed a letter," she said. "With her name in it." "With your name in it," Cale confirmed. "I didn't know that until after he died, when the county clerk contacted me as the nearest neighbor of record. Thomas had filed a letter stating that in the event of his death, the property, the house and all 43 acres, was to pass to his sister, Margot Finley, last known address in Harlan, Ohio." He paused. "He did it about 10 days after that conversation at the fence line." The afternoon had gone very still. Even the grass had stopped moving. "He was protecting it," Margot said. "That's what I think." "From what?" Cale set his hat on the table. "That's what I don't know." She opened the tin box after he left. She had waited until the sound of his wagon had faded entirely, until the yard was quiet and the light had gone flat and gray, and then she had sat down at the table with the box in front of her and looked at it for a long time before touching the latch. It was an ordinary tin, the kind used for tobacco or small tools. The lid was slightly dented on one corner. It had been closed but not locked. Thomas had not been a man who locked things, she remembered. He had believed that if you trusted people with your honesty,
they would generally return the favor. It was a belief that had served him moderately well and failed him occasionally and spectacularly. Inside the box she found a folded piece of paper with a surveyor's mark on it, a rough map of the property, hand-drawn with a circle marked in pencil near what she thought was the creek's eastern bend. A button, brass with a pattern she didn't recognize, not from any garment she'd seen in Thomas's house. A small photograph worn at the edges of two men standing in front of a building she didn't recognize. One of the men was Thomas, younger than she'd last seen him, squinting into the sun. The other man she did not know. He was taller than Thomas, dark-coated, with the kind of face that was arranged carefully into pleasantness and might have been anything underneath. And a folded note in Thomas's handwriting that said only, "If it comes to it, and I hope it doesn't, Margot will know what to do. She always did." She sat with this for a long time. She did not cry. She had not cried yet, and she did not think she was going to. Not here, not in this house, not with so much still unresolved. Thomas had believed she would know what to do. She was not yet certain that he had been right, but she was not going to prove him wrong by falling apart over a tin box and a button and a sentence that was equal parts faith and burden. She set the photograph on the table beside the map. She looked at the man she didn't know. Seb appeared at the door just before supper, as though he had been sent, though she suspected he had come on his own. He stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, looking at the things spread across the table with the frank, assessing gaze of a child who has learned not to ask before looking. "Did you find the ledger?" he said. Margot looked at him. "I haven't opened it yet." "Thomas used to write in it at the kitchen table." He said this as a statement of fact, not nostalgia. "He wrote everything down. What he planted, what the weather did, what people told him." "What people told him," Margot repeated. "He said it was important to keep a record." Seb shifted his weight. "He said memory was unreliable, but paper wasn't." Margot looked at the ledger, still wrapped in its cloth at the bottom of the flour sack. "Did he tell you what was in it?" she asked. "No," Seb said, "but he kept it in the box under his bed, not on the shelf with the farming records. I know because I helped him move it once when the roof leaked and he didn't want it to get wet." He paused. "He said it was private, but he also said it was important that someone know where it was." "And he told you?" "He told me." The boy said this without apparent weight, but it had weight. "I think he was running out of people to tell things to." Margot was quiet for a moment. The light in the room had gone the color of old pewter. "Seb," she said carefully, "the man Thomas spoke with at the fence line, Webb mentioned him. Did you ever see him? A tall man, dark coat?" Something shifted in the boy's face, not fear exactly, closer to the expression of someone who has been carrying a piece of information and has been waiting, with some relief, to put it down. "Once," he said, "I saw him from the ridge. I didn't tell my father because Thomas asked me not to." He looked at his boots. "He said the man's name was Finley." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "Finley," Margot said. "Yes, ma'am." "Did he say anything else?" Seb looked up. His eyes were very serious, the eyes of a child who has spent too much time around adult silences and learned to read what lives in them. He said the man was a relative, Seb said, and that he'd come a long way to make a claim. That night, after Seb had gone home and the lamp had burned low, and Margot had finally opened the ledger and read the first 12 pages in a silence so complete she could hear the creak from the open window. After all of that, she sat with a photograph in her hand and the name Evander Finley printed in her mind like a brand. Her mother's letter, the name she hadn't recognized. Her father's estranged brother, the one who was never spoken of, the one her parents had buried in silence so thorough she had never thought to dig. He had been here. He had stood at Thomas's fence line and spoken to him for 20 minutes about old business and a claim, and 10 days later, Thomas had filed her name with the county clerk as though he were posting a guard. And Thomas had died, and no one had told her. And now she was here, in his house, with his ledger and his map, and a brass button that belonged to no coat in this house. And outside the dark was very large, and the land was hers, and she did not yet know what that meant, or what it was worth, or who else thought they had a right to it. She turned to page 13 of the ledger. At the top, in Thomas's careful hand, E came again today. He says the land was promised before Father's time, and that paper or no paper, blood has a longer memory than any county clerk. I told him Margot's name was filed. He smiled at that. I did not like the smile. I think she should come soon. The word run sat in Margot's chest like a swallowed stone. She closed the ledger. She did not run. She set the book flat on the table beside the tin box and the 3 letters and the photograph of Thomas, and she pressed her palm against the cover as though she could feel something through it. Warmth or warning, or the simple fact of her brother's hand having rested there before hers. She felt nothing but the grain of the cloth binding. Outside, the light had shifted. Morning had become the particular gray of midday clouds building from the northwest, the kind that promised nothing pleasant by evening. She could hear the hens objecting to something in the yard, wind or a shadow or their own obscure anxieties, and the sound of it was oddly steadying. Animals complained about the present. They did not write single words in different ink at the bottom of ledger pages. She put the ledger in the tin box. She put the tin box under the floorboard that Seb had shown her, the loose one beneath the iron stove leg, and she replaced the stove with the same deliberate care Thomas must have used when he first made himself familiar with hiding things. Then she washed her face, put on her better blouse, and walked to town. Caldwell's Main Street was 4 blocks of intention, interrupted by 2 blocks of aftermath. The general store, the feed merchant, the post office, a church that appeared to be resting, 2 buildings that had been something once and were now the memory of something. Margot walked with her eyes level and her pace unhurried, because she had learned long ago that a woman arriving somewhere unfamiliar was watched, and the manner of her arrival became the first sentence of whatever story the town decided to tell about her. She had come to ask about the county clerk's records. She had come to understand what Thomas had filed and what, precisely, it protected. She had come because, sitting in that house with the word "run" sealed inside a tin box under a stove leg, was not a thing she was constitutionally capable of doing, for longer than one morning. She did not make it to the county clerk. She made it as far as the post office. The post office was also, as was common in towns of this size, a dry goods counter, a lending library of 3 shelves, and the office of Mrs. Dorothea Prentice, who was all of these things simultaneously, and who looked up from her ledger, her own ledger, Margot noted, a fat and well-organized one, with the expression of a woman who had been expecting this visit and had prepared accordingly. Miss Finley. Not a question, not quite a greeting. Mrs. Prentice. Margot had learned the name from Lily, who had offered it with the same tone one might use to describe weather that was technically legal. Dorothea Prentice was 51 years old and built like someone who had made a deliberate architectural decision about herself early in life and committed to it. Her hair was iron gray and pinned with such precision that Margot found herself briefly wondering if it was structural. She wore a black dress with a white collar and the expression of a woman who had opinions about collars in general, and this one specifically. "You'll be wanting your mail." Dorothea was already moving to the sorted boxes along the back wall. "I've been holding 2 pieces for you. I wasn't certain when to expect you, given the circumstances." She said circumstances the way a surgeon says complications, clinically, but with the faint pleasure of someone who had anticipated the complication and arranged their instruments. "Thank you." Margot accepted the 2 envelopes, one from Ohio, one with no return address, and tucked them into her coat. "I also came to ask about the county clerk's office. Whether there are public records I can review regarding a land filing." "The clerk's office is in Hardin, 12 miles east." Dorothea folded her hands on the counter. "Mr. Purdy makes the trip on Tuesdays and Fridays, if you need a conveyance. Though I imagine Cale Sutton would take you, given the current arrangement." The pause she placed before current arrangement was not accidental. It was the kind of pause a skilled seamstress makes before cutting, measured, deliberate, intended to produce a specific effect. Margot looked at her. "I'm staying at my brother's house," she said, "which is now my house." "Of course." Dorothea's smile was the shape of agreement without the substance of it. "And Cale Sutton has been very attentive, bringing things over, coming and going at various hours." Another pause, this one thinner and sharper. "People notice in a town this size. I'm sure you understand." "I understand that people notice," Margot said. "I'm less certain I understand the concern." Dorothea unfolded her hands and refolded them. A recalibration. "My concern, Miss Finley, is for your reputation. You are a single woman, newly arrived, with no family in the territory. Cale Sutton is a widower with 2 children and a farm adjacent to your property. The situation, as I say, invites comment. I am not the one making the comment. I am the one telling you that others will, and that it is in your interest to be thoughtful about appearances." It was, Margot recognized, not entirely without kindness. That was what made it difficult. Dorothea Prentice was not lying about the town's capacity for comment, and she was not lying about the vulnerability of a woman without family in a place that had not yet decided what to make of her. She was, in her efficient and proprietary way, offering something she genuinely believed was useful. She was also, in the same breath, drawing a line around Margot's behavior and calling it advice. "Mrs. Prentice," Margot said, keeping her voice even, "my brother is 2 years dead, and I was not informed. The man who did not inform me brought me to my brother's house because there was nowhere else to bring me. And he has since been assisting me in understanding the legal and practical situation I inherited along with 43 acres I did not know I owned. I'm grateful for your concern.
I want to make sure I understand it correctly." She leaned forward slightly, just enough. "Are you suggesting I should have refused his help?" A beat. "I'm suggesting," Dorothea said carefully, "that appearances matter in ways that practical women sometimes underestimate." "I have never underestimated appearances," Margot said. "I've simply learned to be more afraid of other things." The bell above the door rang before Dorothea could respond, and a woman came in for stamps, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary business of the afternoon. Margot stayed long enough to be polite and left before she could be managed any further. She was half a block from the post office when Dorothea came out behind her. "Miss Finley." Margot stopped, turned. Dorothea stood on the step, her posture unchanged, but something in her face had shifted, some small interior adjustment, as though she had made a private decision about what kind of woman she wanted to be in the next 60 seconds. She came down the step and walked to Margot with the brisk efficiency of someone completing an errand they had already talked themselves out of once.
"There is something else," she said, more quietly now, the street voice gone. "Something I did not say inside because the walls of that office are paper thin, and my husband has opinions about my involvement in things that are not postal in nature." She glanced briefly toward the door. "There was a man in town 3 weeks ago. Not from here. He asked my husband about the land registry for properties along Harlan Creek, specifically about Thomas Finley's 43 acres and whether the ownership had been formally transferred." Margot was very still. "My husband told him the records were in Hardin and he'd need to speak to the county clerk. The man thanked him and left." Dorothea met her eyes. "He did not go to Hardin. I know because I asked. He was seen at the feed merchant the following morning, and then he was gone. But he left a name for correspondence, in case anything useful came to light." She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a small folded paper. "I kept it. I don't know why. I'm not a woman who keeps things without reason, and I couldn't determine the reason, so I kept it until I could." Margot took the paper. She unfolded it. The name written there was E. Finley. The air went out of the afternoon. "E," Margot said. "The letter. The ledger. E came again today. He says the land was promised before Father's time." "I don't know what that means to you," Dorothea said, "but you went pale when you read it, so I expect it means something." "It means something," Margot agreed. Dorothea studied her for a moment, not unkindly, Margot thought, and not with the measuring quality of before. Something more direct, more human. "I was not wrong," Dorothea said, "about the town and its opinions. You should know what you are walking into. But I was not." She stopped, chose her words with the same precision she applied to everything else. I was not only speaking about Cale Sutton when I said people notice. I meant that you are being watched. I don't know by whom, I don't know why, but I have lived in this town for 23 years, and I know the difference between ordinary curiosity and the kind that has a purpose. She looked at the paper in Margot's hand. Be careful who you trust with that name. She turned and went back inside without waiting for a response. Margot stood on the street with the folded paper in her hand and the ledger's last line moving through her like a current. I think she should come soon. Thomas had wanted her here. He had made her the legal heir, had filed her name with the county clerk, had written it into every document he could find, because whatever E. Finley had wanted, whatever old claim, whatever promise made before her father's time, Thomas had believed that her presence, her name on the land, was the thing that would hold it. He had been right to believe it. She understood that now. She also understood, with a cold and clarifying certainty, that E. Finley had been in this town 3 weeks ago asking questions, that he had not gone to the county clerk, that he had left a name for correspondence, which meant he expected to be contacted, which meant he expected someone in this town to be useful to him, which meant he was not finished. She put the paper in her coat pocket beside the 2 unopened letters and walked toward the edge of town, toward the road that would take her back to Harlan Creek, back to the farm, back to the tin box under the stove leg and the ledger inside it. She had walked perhaps 50 yards when she heard it. A horse, slow and unhurried, coming along the road from the eastern direction. From Hardin, from the county clerk's office. She did not turn immediately. She listened to the pace of it, the particular rhythm of a horse being ridden by someone in no hurry, someone who had already done what they came to do and was returning at their leisure. When she turned, she saw a man she did not recognize, sitting a gray horse, watching her with the patient and specific attention of someone who already knew her name. He touched the brim of his hat. He smiled. She did not like the smile. The name landed wrong. Margot turned it over in her mind even as she stood perfectly still on the post office steps, her hand pressed flat against the letters in her pocket, her face arranged into something she hoped resembled calm. Voss. Not Finley. Not the name anyone in Caldwell had called her. Not the name on Thomas's deed, not the name on her ticket stub or her trunk, or the letter she'd received in Ohio that had started all of this. Voss. Her mother's name before the marriage, her mother's name, and before that, her grandmother's. And before that, she thought of the letter still folded in her pocket, of the name Evander Finley, of all the things her parents had declined to say. Before that, something else entirely. I think, Margot said, that you have me confused with someone. The man on the gray horse did not shift in his saddle. He was perhaps 50, with a lean, sun-weathered face and the kind of stillness that is not peace, but its opposite. A stillness that has been practiced, that has been made into a tool. His coat was good quality. His boots were better. I don't believe I do, he said pleasantly. Behind her she heard the post office door open and close, and then Mrs. Prentice's voice, tight and careful. Mr. Harlan, I wasn't expecting you in town today. Harlan. Margot filed that away. Just passing through, Dorothea. He did not look at Mrs. Prentice. He kept looking at Margot. I heard the westbound came in last week. Thought I'd welcome the new arrival properly."
"She's been welcomed,"
Mrs. Prentice said, and there was something in the older woman's voice that Margot had not heard before. Not the performative disapproval she had used in the post office, but something quieter and more honest. Something that might, in another context, be called caution. "Cale Sutton's seen to it." "Yes," the man said. "I imagine he has." He looked at Margot with that patient, unpleasant smile, and she understood with a particular clarity that comes not from intelligence alone, but from having spent a lifetime reading the rooms she was barely permitted to enter, that this man was not asking a question. He was making a statement. He was telling her what he already knew, and what he already knew was considerable. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," Margot said. "Warren Harlan." He touched his hat again. The gesture was courteous and entirely without courtesy. "I own the land east of Harlan Creek, and a good portion of what's west of it as things currently stand." "Not all of it," Margot said. Something shifted behind his eyes. "No," he agreed, "not quite all." She walked back to the house. She did not run. Running, she had learned in the mill and before the mill and in the long years of managing with less than was needed, was the one thing you could not afford to do in front of a man like Warren Harlan. Running told him where you were going. Running told him what you feared. Running made you legible, and legibility in the presence of that particular kind of patience was its own form of surrender. She walked at a steady, unhurried pace, and she did not look back, and she did not open the new letters from her pocket, and she did not let herself think about the name he had called her until she was through the door and the door was closed behind her. Then she stood in Thomas's kitchen, her kitchen, she reminded herself, her kitchen now, 43 acres and a house and a water pump with a temperamental lever. And she pressed her back against the door and let herself breathe. Voss. She pulled out the letter with no return address and opened it. The handwriting was cramped and unfamiliar, and the paper was cheap, the kind used by someone who either had little money or wanted to appear that way. It read, "If you are reading this, you have arrived. Do not trust the man who calls himself Harlan. The box your brother left you will tell you what he was afraid to write plainly. The name Voss is your protection, not your burden. There are people in that town who know the rest. Find the minister." No signature. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it with the others. Reverend Amos Birch was in the small yard behind the church, splitting wood with the methodical efficiency of a man who had been doing it long enough that his mind was entirely elsewhere. He was perhaps 60, with a round, mild face, and the kind of eyes that had seen enough human foolishness to be neither shocked nor delighted by any particular instance of it. He set down his axe when he saw her coming through the gate, and regarded her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. "Miss Finley," he said. "Reverend Birch." She stopped a few feet away. "I believe you knew my brother." "I did." He gestured toward a pair of rough wooden chairs near the church wall, the kind kept outside for conversations that needed air. "Sit down if you like." She sat. He sat across from her, set his hands on his knees, and waited. It was a particular kind of waiting, the waiting of a man who had learned that most people, given enough silence, will eventually say the thing they actually came to say. "Warren Harlan stopped me in front of the post office this morning," Margot said. "He called me Miss Voss." Birch was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, I thought he might move quickly once he knew you'd arrived." "You were expecting this?" "I was hoping for more time." He looked at her steadily. "Your brother came to me about 3 weeks before he died. He was not a church-going man. You'll know that better than I do. But he came to me because I am also the county's notary, and because I am, he said, the only man in Caldwell whose self-interest does not point in Harlan's direction." "And does it not?" "I have a congregation," Birch said simply. "My interest is in their welfare, which is a somewhat different thing from my personal welfare. Those two interests do not always align, but in this particular matter, they do." Margot waited. "The land your brother held," Birch said, "sits on the only reliable water access between Harlan's eastern holdings and the Valley Road. Without it, his consolidation, and he has been consolidating for the better part of a decade, is incomplete. He has been trying to acquire that parcel since before your brother took possession of it." He paused. "Your brother was not easy to move." "No," Margot said. "He wouldn't have been." "When Thomas became ill, Harlan sent a man to negotiate. Thomas refused. When it became clear that Thomas would not recover, Harlan assumed the property would pass through the estate without a clear heir, at which point he had certain legal arrangements prepared that would have allowed him to make a claim." Birch folded his hands. "Your brother anticipated this. The filing with the county clerk, naming you as his heir, was done specifically to prevent it. But Harlan's people searched the records and found something your brother may not have known they would find." "The name Voss," Margot said. "Your mother's family had a prior claim on a portion of that land. A very old claim, disputed, never fully resolved, predating your brother's deed by nearly 30 years. Harlan's position is that the Voss claim, if it exists, supersedes your brother's transfer." "That the land was never properly Thomas's to give." He looked at her carefully. "It is not a strong legal argument, but it does not need to be strong. It only needs to be expensive." Margot sat with this for a moment, looking at the woodpile, at the careful stack of it, at the work of someone who had prepared for winter with patience and without complaint. "The tin box," she said. Birch nodded slowly. "I don't know what's in it. Thomas didn't tell me. But he told me it would answer the question of the Voss claim, one way or another. He said—" He paused, seeming to select his words with some care. "He said it would either end it or arm you." "He said arm me." Those were his words. She thought of Thomas, whom she had not seen in 7 years, whom she had written letters to for 2 years after his death without knowing it, whom she had imagined living out here in the dry western air, getting on with things. She thought of him being careful, being watchful, filing papers at the county clerk's office in his final weeks, writing letters he knew he might not live to send, hiding things in tin boxes for a sister who would arrive by train with a one-way ticket and the wrong name. Stubborn, Seb had told her. Thomas had called her stubborn. She wondered if he had meant it as comfort. "The practical solution," Margot said. "You mentioned you were the county's notary." Birch regarded her with what she now recognized as careful approval. The approval of a reasonable man who has been waiting to see whether the person in front of him is also a reasonable person. "There are several avenues," he said. "Some of them depend on what's in the box. Some of them depend on how quickly we move before Harlan files his claim formally. He won't want to file formally if he can avoid it. A formal filing becomes a public record, and there are people in this county who would not look kindly on what it would reveal about his methods." He paused. "He would prefer you to simply agree to sell, quietly, at a price that seems fair until you understand what the land is worth to him." "He'll come to the house," Margot said. "Yes, probably tomorrow or the day after. He'll come with a number and a smile and a great deal of patience, because patience has served him well." Birch looked at her. "I would like to be there when he does, not as a minister, as a notary." "As a witness. And Cale Sutton?" Something moved briefly across Birch's face, not quite amusement, but its quieter cousin. "Cale Sutton," he said, "has been waiting for someone to give him a reason to stop being careful. I think you may be that reason. I think Thomas believed so too, which is why he arranged for Cale to meet you at the station." Margot thought of Cale on the platform, his hat in his hands, the particular guilt of a man who had been carrying something too long and did not know how to set it down. She stood. "I need to open the box," she said. "Yes," Birch agreed. "I believe you do." She was halfway back down the road to the house, the afternoon light going long and copper across the dry grass, when she saw Cale's wagon parked outside her gate. He was standing beside it, not moving toward the house, simply standing with the particular posture of a man who has decided to wait and is not sure he has the right to. Beside him, to Margot's considerable surprise, was Mrs. Dorothea Prentice, holding her good hat against the wind with one hand and looking, for the first time since Margot had encountered her, uncertain. Margot walked through the gate. "There's a man," Cale said without preamble, "been asking questions at the dry goods. About you. About the deed. About—" He stopped. "Dorothea heard something this morning she thought you should know." Mrs. Prentice pressed her lips together briefly, as though the words required some interior negotiation before they would consent to be spoken. Then she said, "Harlan's man has been to the county clerk. This morning, early." She met Margot's eyes with an expression that was not quite apology, but was adjacent to it. "He was looking at the Voss records." "I know," Margot said. They both looked at her. "The box," she said. "We need to open the box tonight." She walked past them toward the house, her hand already on the door, and she did not look back to see if they followed. She knew, with a certainty she could not entirely explain, that they would. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that when she knelt beside the stove and pried up the floorboard and lifted the tin box into the light, it would be lighter than she expected. And when she opened it, she would find the ledger, the letters, and one additional document she had never been told to expect. A document with her name on it. Not Finley. Voss. The document was a deed. Not a will, not a letter, not a legal notice of the kind that had been following her across the country in delayed envelopes, but a deed of land transfer, handwritten in a clerk's careful script, dated 3 years prior, bearing the names of two parties. One was Thomas Finley. The other was a woman named Corinne Voss, deceased. Her mother. Margot sat with it in her hands and heard the door open behind her. She did not turn immediately. She had learned, in the last several days, that the quality of a silence told you almost everything you needed to know before you looked. This silence was not Cale's. It was not Seb's. It was not the silence of Warren Harlan, which she imagined would carry with it the particular weight of a man who had never once been uncertain of his welcome. This silence had footsteps in it, deliberate, unhurried, and the faint sound of a coat being unbuttoned. "You left Birch's in a hurry," said the woman. "He sent me after you." Margot turned. She had not met Willa Darnell yet, though she had heard the name. The woman standing in the doorway of Thomas's house was 58 or thereabouts, with a face that had made its peace with weathering and a posture that suggested she had long since stopped apologizing for taking up space. She wore a dark wool coat and carried nothing in her hands. She looked at Margot the way a doctor looks at a patient, not unkindly, but without the softening that kindness sometimes requires. "You're the boarding house," Margot said. "I own it," Willa said. "There's a difference." She looked at the tin box, the open floorboard, the documents spread across Margot's knees. "Birch told me what he told you. I imagine it wasn't the whole of it." "He told me the name Voss. He told me my mother was born here. He told me Thomas found out." Margot set the deed carefully on the floor beside her. "He told me Warren Harlan was the reason she left." "That's the shape of it," Willa said. "But shapes leave out the edges." She looked around the room, located the chair nearest the stove, the one Lily Aldridge had occupied 2 days before, and sat down in it without being invited. Margot noted this and found she did not mind it. "You want the edges? I want all of it." Willa looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Corinne Voss was Warren Harlan's half-sister. Different mothers, same father, old Gerald Harlan, who was not a good man and raised at least one son in his own image. When Gerald died, he left the eastern 43 acres to Corinne outright, which was not what Warren expected, and not what Warren accepted. Corinne was 22 years old. She had no husband, no particular standing, and a half-brother who had decided the land was his by right of temperament, if nothing else. Willa folded her hands in her lap. She left, went east, married a man named Finley, had 2 children, and never came back. Margot said nothing. She was thinking of her mother's hands, the way they moved when she was anxious, a particular stillness she had always mistaken for composure. "She died without telling her children," Willa continued, "but she told her lawyer, and her lawyer told Thomas 3 years ago, when the estate was finally settled and the deed was finally recorded. The land your brother owned, the land you are sitting on right now, it was never Thomas's to begin with. It was always Corinne Voss's land, passed to her children, passed to him, passed now to you." Margot looked at the deed in her hands. "Warren Harlan knows." "Warren Harlan has known for 3 years. He's been waiting for Thomas to make a mistake, or run out of money, or die without leaving proper papers. Thomas did 2 of those 3 things." Willa's voice did not change. "He did not make the mistake."
The stranger at the fence line, Margot said. 6 weeks before Thomas died.
Harlan's man. Came to offer Thomas a settlement, some sum to walk away from the deed and let the land revert quietly. Willa's mouth thinned.
Thomas refused. Filed the inheritance letter 10 days later. Sent your address to Aldous Webb. Wrote you the invitation.
She paused.
He was protecting the property, but he was also protecting you.
Margot felt the particular weight of this settle, somewhere in her chest. Not grief exactly, because grief was something she had been carrying since the train platform and had made a kind of accommodation with. This was something adjacent to grief. This was the understanding that her brother had known he was dying, had known the land was contested, and had spent his remaining weeks making sure she would have something to come to, even if she would not understand what it was when she arrived.
He couldn't tell me in a letter,
she said. He couldn't tell you in a letter, Willa confirmed.
Because letters can be intercepted. Harlan has friends at the post office.
Margot thought of Mrs. Prentice. She thought of the held mail. She thought of the careful, probing conversation outside the post office door, and understood now that it had not been gossip, it had been reconnaissance.
What does Harlan actually want? She asked. He wants the deed nullified. He wants the land recorded in his name. He wants what his father's will denied him, and he has wanted it for 30 years.
Willa looked at her steadily.
What he doesn't want is a woman from Ohio who has the deed in her hands and the name Voss on a document that's been filed in the county record.
Margot looked down at the papers in her lap. The deed, the letters from Thomas. The letter from her mother that had arrived in Ohio and been read in this same house at this same stove. The letter with the name Evander Finley, which she had not yet fully understood.
Evander Finley, she said.
Willa raised an eyebrow slightly. Not surprise exactly, but the adjustment of a woman recalibrating. You know that name.
My mother mentioned him in a letter. My father's estranged brother, never spoken of.
He's spoken of here, Willa said. He's the county clerk. The room was very quiet.
He was a friend of Corinne's, Willa said, before she went east. He came here about 15 years later, coincidence or not, I've never been certain. He's been the county clerk for 11 years. He's the one who recorded the deed transfer when Thomas filed it.
She paused.
He's the one who will need to see that document in your hands, with your name on it, before Warren Harlan finds a judge sympathetic enough to start asking questions about the original filing.
Margot sat with this for a moment. Then she set the documents carefully back into the tin box, closed the lid, and stood up. She went to the county clerk's office that afternoon. Evander Finley was a slight man of about 65, with the careful hands of someone who had spent a lifetime handling paper and understood its fragility. He looked up when she came through the door, and something moved across his face. Not shock, not quite, but the expression of a man who has been expecting a thing for so long that its arrival feels both inevitable and surreal. You look like her, he said.
I've been told that,
Margot said. She set the deed on his desk. He looked at it without touching it for a long moment, then looked up at her. Thomas wrote to me, he said, before he died. He told me you'd come eventually, if the letter reached you. He wasn't certain it would. It reached me. I know. I made sure of it. He said this simply, without ceremony. It took longer than it should have. I'm sorry for that. Margot thought of 2 years of letters sent to a dead man. She thought of the delay, the complications, the estate that had taken so long to settle. She thought of Cale Sutton standing on a train platform in the early morning, wrestling with something he did not know how to say. "What do I need to do?" she asked. He told her. It took 4 days. There were documents to file, witnesses to provide, a notarization that required a man to ride 12 miles to a neighboring county because the local notary was, as Willa put it, sympathetic in the wrong direction. There were conversations Margot did not fully understand with people whose names she was only beginning to learn, in a town that was only beginning to take her measure. On the second day, Cale came to the house with Seb. He did not explain himself. He helped her move the stove so she could retrieve the tin box more easily, and Seb fed the hens with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he had shown on her first morning, and no one said anything about any of it. On the third day, Lily Aldridge arrived with a pot of something that smelled like it had been cooking since before dawn, set it on the stove, and sat down in Thomas's chair. "Harlan was at the post office this morning," she said. "I know," Margot said. "He asked Mrs. Prentice if you'd received any additional mail." "I know that too." Lily looked at her with frank appraisal. "You're not frightened of him." "I didn't say that." "You don't look frightened." Margot thought about this. "I looked frightened on the train platform," she said. "I looked frightened when Cale told me Thomas was dead. I looked frightened when I read my mother's letter." She paused. "I've used up a certain amount of it." Lily considered this with the seriousness it deserved and nodded. On the fourth day, Evander Finley filed the documentation. The deed was confirmed. The land, 43 acres along Harlan Creek, the house, the hen house, the temperamental water pump, was recorded in the name of Margot Finley, born Margot Finley, granddaughter of a man who had left the Eastern Acres to a daughter he perhaps understood better than his son ever would. Warren Harlan did not come to the house. He did not send anyone. Willa told her that evening that this was not the end of it, that men like Harlan did not simply accept the closing of a door that they had decided should remain open. There would be other approaches, other pressures, other slow and patient attempts to make her uncomfortable enough to leave. "I know," Margot said. They were sitting at the kitchen table, the tin box between them, the documents returned to it, and the lid closed. The stove was doing its work. Outside, the light was going the particular color it went here in the West, a shade Margot had no Ohio word for, something between amber and rust, something that belonged entirely to this sky, this creek, this ground. "You'll stay then?" Willa said. It was not quite a question. Margot looked at the photograph of Thomas on the wall. She had straightened it 2 days ago because it had been hanging slightly crooked, and it had been bothering her since she arrived. She thought of a man who had been ill and afraid and deliberate, who had filed a legal letter and written an invitation and entrusted it to a neighbor and waited, in whatever way the dying wait, for his sister to come west and take what was hers.
She thought of a woman named Corinne Voss, who had left this land at 22 and never come back, and who had made sure, in the only way available to her, that it would come back to her children anyway. She thought of a name she had not known she carried until 4 days ago. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay." Willa nodded once, the nod of a woman who had expected this answer and found it satisfactory. She stood, buttoned her coat, and moved toward the door.
"Birch is holding a service Sunday," she said. "Thomas's grave hasn't had any words said over it. He died before Birch arrived in town." Margot looked up. "Cale's been tending it," Willa said, "in case you were wondering." She left. The door closed behind her with the particular sound of a door in a house that had finally been settled into. A sound that belonged now to this house, and to the woman sitting at its table, and to the 43 acres that ran east to the creek and had been waiting for 30 years for someone to come home. Margot opened the tin box one more time. She took out the deed, smoothed it flat on the table, and read her name on it again. Not to confirm it, because she was past the need for confirmation. She read it the way you read something you intend to memorize, the way you read something you mean to keep. Then she folded it carefully, set it back in the tin, and went to see about the hens.